The first thing I heard was my wife's shoulder striking the brick column beside our front steps. The second was my son-in-law saying, "She did that to herself." By the time I reached the doorway, Ruth was crumpled on the walkway, with one hand pressed against the side of her head, blood working its way between her fingers, and Caleb was standing 3 feet above her, with a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. I was 68 years old, but for one hot second, I forgot every year of my age. I started toward him with my fists closed. Then Ruth made a sound I had never heard in 43 years of marriage. A thin, frightened gasp that told me she could not get a full breath. I turned away from Caleb and dropped beside my wife. "Ruth, look at me. Don't move your neck." Caleb backed toward his SUV and said, "Grant, don't make this into something it wasn't." I pulled out my phone and called 911. When the dispatcher answered, I gave her our address in Worthington, Ohio, and said clearly, "My son-in-law pushed my wife down the front steps." She struck her head and shoulder. "He's leaving now in a black Tahoe." Our doorbell camera recorded it. Caleb stopped with his hand on the driver's door. That was the first time his face changed. Until then, he had looked irritated, as if Ruth bleeding on the walkway were an inconvenience he had been forced to schedule around. I looked directly at him while the dispatcher told me to keep Ruth still. "The police are on their way," I said. Caleb stared at me for 2 seconds, climbed into his Tahoe, and drove off. I did not chase him. I did not shout after him. I held Ruth's hand until the paramedics arrived, and when one of them asked what had happened, I told the truth again. No softened language. No family excuse. No, she lost her balance. I said, "Her son-in-law pushed her." A patrol officer arrived while they were loading Ruth into the ambulance. I gave him access to the doorbell camera clip from my phone and watched him replay the 8 seconds that changed our family. Caleb stood behind Ruth while she held the folder against her chest. He reached for it. She pulled it away. He shoved her with both hands. She stumbled backward over the top step and hit the brick column before falling to the walkway. The camera also caught him bending down, not to help her, but to snatch the folder from beside her leg. Then it caught me opening the front door. The officer looked at the screen, then at me. "Do you know what was in the folder?" he asked. I did. That was the part Caleb did not know. 3 weeks earlier, Ruth had brought the same folder into my workshop and asked me a question that seemed harmless at the time. "Grant, did I sign something for Leah and Caleb last month?" My daughter had been married to Caleb Voss for 6 years. He was 42, a mortgage loan officer with a polished smile, expensive shoes, and a talent for turning every conversation into a performance about how much smarter he was than everyone else. I had never liked the way he spoke to my daughter, but not liking a man and accusing him of a crime are very different things. I spent 35 years investigating insurance claims, and if the job taught me anything, it was to separate suspicion from evidence. Ruth showed me photocopies of 2 documents Caleb had asked her to keep for tax records. One was a consent form connected to a home equity application. The other carried what looked like Ruth's signature beside a notary seal. Ruth swore she had never signed either document. I compared them to the signature on our tax return, our trust, and the anniversary card she had given me a month earlier. The handwriting was close enough to fool someone who had never watched Ruth sign her name. It was not close enough to fool me. The next morning I called an attorney named Marisa Cole, a woman I knew from my claims investigation days. We did not accuse Caleb. We quietly started verifying. The property connected to the paperwork was a small duplex Ruth had inherited from her mother in Dayton and rented out for retirement income. Caleb had spent months telling Ruth that he could restructure the mortgage and unlock equity to help Leah and him through a temporary cash problem. Ruth had repeatedly told him no, yet the paperwork suggested somebody had already tried to move forward. Marisa obtained certified copies from the county recorder, contacted the title company through proper channels, and asked the notary whose seal appeared on the form whether she had ever met Ruth. Her answer came back 2 days before Caleb pushed my wife. She had not. Worse, the notary had left the firm months before the date shown on the document. Marisa told me the evidence was enough to notify the lender's fraud department and the title insurer, but we both agreed Ruth should decide when to proceed because the property was hers. That was why the folder mattered. Ruth had finally decided that morning that she would sign an affidavit stating she had never authorized the transaction. Caleb came to our house before she could leave for Maurice's office. He demanded the papers. Ruth refused. Then he pushed her. Standing beside the ambulance with the patrol officer still holding my phone, I realized the decision no longer belonged only to us. Caleb had taken a financial deception and attached violence to it. I called Marisa before following the ambulance. She answered on the second ring. Ruth was attacked, I told her. Caleb pushed her down our steps. Police have the video. Marisa went completely quiet. Is she alive? Yes. I looked at the ambulance pulling away. File the fraud affidavit. 4 words. That was all I needed to say. Marisa understood that I was not asking her to ruin Caleb. I was asking her to send verified evidence to the people who had the legal responsibility to act on it. Ruth had a fractured collarbone, 6 stitches above her right ear, and a concussion that kept her in Riverside Methodist Hospital overnight for observation. By 7 that evening, the worst of the medical fear had eased, but something else had taken its place. She lay propped against 2 pillows, her right arm secured in a sling, staring at the dark window as if she were afraid to look at me. You told the police he pushed me, she said. It was not a question. I did. She closed her eyes. Grant, Leah is going to lose everything. There it was. The reason I had been watching my wife make excuses for Caleb for almost a year. Not stupidity. Not weakness. Fear. Caleb had spent months convincing Ruth that my daughter's house was hanging by a thread and that one wrong move from us would bankrupt them. Whenever he insulted Ruth, she tolerated it because she believed he was under pressure. When he grabbed her wrist at Thanksgiving, she said he had been tired. When he yelled at her in a restaurant because she asked my daughter whether she was sleeping enough, Ruth told me not to embarrass Leah by confronting him. I had hated it. But until the forged paperwork surfaced, I had not understood the leverage he was using. Now Ruth looked at me with tears filling her eyes and whispered. He told me they were 3 payments behind. He said, if I made trouble over the duplex, the bank would take their house. He said Leah would blame me for the rest of her life. I pulled my chair closer. Their mortgage is current. He wonked at me sharply. How do you know? Marisa checked the public filings. There is no foreclosure, no delinquency notice, no lien that matches what Caleb told you. Ruth's face went still. Before she could answer, my daughter rushed into the room wearing navy blue scrubs under a winter coat. Leah worked nights as a respiratory therapist at Ohio State, and she looked exhausted even before she saw her mother. She kissed Ruth on the forehead, then turned to me. Dad, what happened? I told her. I did not editorialize. I did not tell her what kind of man she had married. I said, your husband tried to take a folder from your mother. She refused. He pushed her down our steps. The camera recorded it. Police have the video. My daughter stared at me as if I had started speaking another language. Caleb said Mom fell while they were arguing. Ruth began to speak, but I raised one hand gently. Your mother doesn't need to defend anyone tonight. Leah looked between us. Where is Caleb? I almost laughed at how closely the question matched the last 6 years of our lives. Something happened, and somehow the first concern became Caleb. I don't know, I said. The police are trying to reach him. Leah pulled out her phone. She had 3 missed calls from him. She stepped into the hallway to return one. Through the glass panel in the door, I watched her shoulders tense. She came back 4 minutes later with anger replacing confusion. He says you set him up. Ruth flinched. Set him up how? He says Dad has been trying to destroy his career because Dad never respected him. I felt the old instinct to defend myself, but I forced it down. I had spent decades interviewing people after fires, collisions, thefts, and staged accidents. The fastest way to lose credibility is to talk when evidence can talk for you. I opened the doorbell video and handed Leah my phone. She watched it once, then again. On the 3rd viewing, she paused at the moment Caleb's hands hit Ruth's back. Her face lost all color. He told me he tried to catch her. The camera doesn't show that, I said. Leah sat down slowly. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Ruth did something that surprised me. She reached across the bed with her left hand and touched our daughter's wrist. Honey, has he been telling you your house is about to be foreclosed? Leah frowned. No. Why? Ruth looked at me. That single answer cracked something Caleb had spent months building. Before we could go further, my phone buzzed with a message from Marisa. The lender's fraud department had acknowledged Ruth's affidavit. The title company had placed an internal stop on any transaction involving the Dayton duplex until the disputed documents were investigated. The mortgage company employing Caleb had also been notified because his employee identifier appeared on one of the application drafts. None of that meant he was guilty. None of it meant his career was over. It meant the right people were finally going to ask questions. I did not show the message to Leah. Not yet. My daughter needed to process one truth at a time. A detective arrived around 9 and interviewed Ruth after a doctor cleared her to speak. This time, Ruth did not say. She slipped. Her voice shook, but she told him exactly what happened. When he asked why Caleb had been at our house, she explained the papers and the pressure surrounding the duplex. The detective wrote everything down and asked whether she feared Caleb would come back. Ruth looked at Leah before answering. I fear what he'll do when he realizes he can't control the story anymore. My daughter lowered her eyes. An hour later, she left the hospital alone. Caleb had texted her more than 20 times. She did not tell me where she was going, and I did not ask her to choose sides. I only said, keep your phone on. If you feel unsafe, call the police before you call me. She nodded and hugged her mother carefully. As she walked out, Ruth whispered, she's going back to him. I squeezed her hand. Maybe. But now she's going back with questions. By noon the next day, those questions were spreading well beyond our family. Caleb's employer placed him on paid administrative leave, while its compliance department reviewed the disputed loan application. The title company confirmed that the notary seal on Ruth's document did not match its records. Marisa sent the original electronic copies to investigators without touching or altering their metadata. The lender asked Ruth to provide specimen signatures and a sworn statement. Nothing happened instantly, and that mattered to me. Real consequences rarely arrive like lightning. They arrive as doors that stop opening. Caleb's first closed door was his company email. His second was access to new loan files. His third came when his branch manager told him not to contact Ruth about the investigation. By late afternoon, Caleb called me. I was sitting beside Ruth in our living room after bringing her home from the hospital, and for a second I considered letting it ring. Then I answered on speaker so Ruth could hear. You happy now? He said. His voice had none of the smooth confidence I was used to. My company locked me out. Compliance is treating me like a criminal. I looked at Ruth. Did you push my wife down the steps? He ignored the question. You sent those papers in. Ruth signed an affidavit saying she didn't sign documents bearing her name. You coached her. Ruth's expression hardened. I had seen that look only a few times in our marriage. It usually appeared when someone mistook her gentleness for ignorance. She leaned toward the phone. Caleb, I know how I sign my own name. Silence. Then he tried another route. Ruth, I'm sorry you fell, but Grant is turning an accident into a war. Ruth's fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. You pushed me. Caleb breathed into the phone without speaking. I remember, she said. I remember your hands. He hung up. That was the first time Ruth said the words without looking at me for permission. That evening, my daughter called from a grocery store parking lot. Her voice was low and uneven. Dad, I need to ask you something. Did Caleb ever tell you why he wanted Grandma's duplex? He said he wanted to refinance it to help you too. That's what he told me too. I waited. But I found something. She explained that she and Caleb shared an old tablet at home, one they mostly used for streaming. Caleb had forgotten that his messages still synced to it. After their argument the night before, Leah opened the tablet because she wanted proof that her parents had somehow sabotaged him. Instead, she found a chain of messages between Caleb and a man named Trevor Dane, a private lender I had never heard of. Caleb had been trying to raise $180,000 to cover losses from speculative real estate deals. One message read, "Once Ruth's equity clears, I can clean up the rest before Leah ever sees it." Another said, "She'll sign if I make her think their house is on the line." My daughter started crying before she finished reading the words to me. He wasn't saving our house. He was using Mom. It sounds that way. Why didn't you tell me you were investigating him? Because 3 weeks ago I didn't know enough. I had suspicious documents. That's all. If I'd called you and accused your husband of forgery without proof, what would you have done? She stayed quiet. We both knew the answer. Dad, I have to go home and get some things. My chest tightened. Don't go alone. He's not there. He's meeting with a lawyer. Then call the non-emergency police line and ask if an officer can stand by while you collect your belongings. She started to protest. I cut her off gently. Your mother almost died because we kept telling ourselves family problems should stay inside the family. We are done doing that. 10 minutes after that call, my own doorbell rang. 2 detectives stood on the porch. For one frightening second, I thought something had happened to Leah. Instead, the older detective held out a card and said, Mr. Holloway, Caleb Voss filed a complaint alleging you threatened him, tampered with financial documents, and used your former investigative connections to interfere with his employment. There it was, the counterattack I had expected but still hated. I invited them in, then called Marissa, before answering any detailed questions. She arrived 40 minutes later carrying a thin file and a chain of custody log showing exactly when we had received each document, when certified copies were requested, and when Ruth's affidavit was executed. We gave the detectives the unedited doorbell footage, not a clipped version. We gave them Marissa's correspondence with the title company. We gave them Ruth's statement. Then I said the one thing Caleb apparently never expected me to say. If I broke a law, investigate me too. The younger detective looked up. Excuse me? Don't take my word because I'm older or because my wife is hurt. Follow the records. Marissa glanced at me and almost smiled. 2 hours later, the detectives left with copies. They did not tell me Caleb's complaint was false. They did not need to. Evidence would decide that. That night, my daughter arrived at our house with one suitcase, her work bag, and the old tablet wrapped inside a towel. She had asked an officer to accompany her while she collected her belongings. Caleb never appeared. She set the tablet on our kitchen table and said, I'm not ready to talk about divorce. I'm not ready to talk about anything. I just don't want to sleep in that house tonight. Ruth stood carefully, crossed the room with her arm still in a sling, and opened her left arm. My daughter stepped into it and cried against her shoulder. For the first time since the attack, I felt something stronger than anger. I felt the beginning of safety. Over the following 10 days, Caleb's carefully managed life began to separate into facts he could no longer bundle together with charm. His employer's compliance team confirmed that a loan application had been created using Ruth's personal information without a completed in-person authorization record. The notary whose seal appeared on the form signed a statement denying she had notarized Ruth's signature. The title company produced access logs showing Caleb had downloaded draft documents after Ruth had already told him she would not proceed. The police obtained the original doorbell camera recording directly from the cloud provider, which meant Caleb could no longer suggest I had edited it. Leah voluntarily gave investigators the synced messages from the tablet after speaking with her own attorney. The state licensing division opened a review of Caleb's mortgage originator license. His employer did not fire him immediately. They completed their process first. When they finally terminated him, the letter cited violations of company policy and compliance rules, not anything I had said. That distinction mattered. I wanted Caleb to face consequences for his actions, not for my anger. Meanwhile, Ruth started seeing a trauma counselor recommended by her doctor. After her second appointment, she came home and sat at the kitchen table with me for almost an hour without speaking. Then she said, I keep thinking about how many times I apologized to him when he was cruel to me. I poured coffee and waited. I thought if I stayed calm, Leah would stay safe. But all I taught him was that I would absorb whatever he did. She looked at her sling. I don't want to be that person anymore. You were trying to protect our daughter. Protection isn't the same as silence. I knew better than to turn her realization into my speech. It belonged to her. 3 days later, Caleb's attorney contacted Marissa and requested a meeting. The purpose was not to extract a confession or offer a magical deal. Caleb wanted access to personal items Leah had removed from their home and wanted Ruth to withdraw a civil protection. Request her attorney had helped her file. Marissa suggested a conference room at her downtown Columbus office, with attorneys present and no private contact between Caleb and Ruth. Ruth surprised me by saying she wanted to attend. "You don't have to see him," I told her. "I know. That's why I want to." The meeting took place on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Caleb arrived with a criminal defense attorney named Elliot Barnes. He looked thinner than he had 2 weeks earlier, but not broken. I was glad. I did not need him broken. I needed him unable to keep hurting people. Leah sat beside Ruth at the conference table. I sat on Ruth's other side. Marisa opened by explaining the narrow purpose of the meeting. Caleb's lawyer did most of the speaking. They discussed property, Leah's belongings, access to the house, and the pending protection request. For nearly 20 minutes, Caleb barely looked at us. Then Ruth asked Marisa if she could say something. Marisa nodded. Ruth turned toward Caleb. "Why did you tell me Leah would lose her house if I didn't help you?" His attorney immediately placed a hand on Caleb's arm. "You do not need to answer that." Caleb pulled his arm away. Pride had always been stronger than caution in him. "Because I was trying to fix a temporary problem." Leah's face tightened. "A temporary problem you hid from me?" Barnes said. "Caleb, stop." Caleb ignored him. "I was going to put everything back." My daughter leaned forward. "With my mother's property?" "It was a loan, Leah. Using a signature she didn't write?" Barnes closed his folder. "We're done discussing the financial allegations." Caleb finally looked at Ruth. "I never meant for you to get hurt." Ruth's voice stayed steady. "Then tell me what you meant when you put both hands on my back." The room went silent. Caleb looked at his lawyer. Barnes said nothing. Caleb looked down at the table. Ruth continued. "You don't have to answer me. The camera already did. I needed to see whether you could look me in the eye and still pretend it was an accident." Caleb's jaw tightened. "You all want me to be a monster because that makes this easier." My daughter reached into her bag and placed her wedding ring on the table. It made a tiny sound against the wood. "No," she said. "I wanted you to be my husband. That's what made it so hard." Caleb stared at the ring. For the first time since I had known him, he seemed to understand that the most important thing he was losing was not a license or a paycheck. Leah stood. "My attorney will contact yours about the house. I filed for legal separation this morning. Do not come to my parents' home." Caleb looked at her in shock. "Leah, wait. I waited 6 years." Barnes said his client's name again, firmer this time, and Caleb finally stopped talking. The meeting ended without drama. No detectives burst through the door. No one handed Caleb a document that magically ended his life. We walked to the elevator, and just before the doors opened, Ruth exhaled like she had been holding her breath for 10 days. "I thought seeing him would make me afraid," she said. "Did it?" I asked. She shook her head. "It made me tired." My daughter took her hand. "Me too. That was enough." The legal process moved slower than the emotional one. Caleb was charged in connection with the assault after prosecutors reviewed the video, medical records, and witness statements. The financial investigation took longer because lenders, licensing officials, and attorneys had to establish who created which documents and when. I stayed out of it, unless someone asked me for records. That became an important part of my own recovery. For weeks I had been measuring every day by what happened to Caleb. Once Ruth was home, Leah was safe, and the evidence was in professional hands. I had to remember that protecting my family did not mean spending the rest of my life watching my son-in-law fall. Leah moved into a furnished apartment near the hospital where she worked. She filed for divorce after her attorney finished reviewing the debts Caleb had hidden from her. The numbers were worse than she expected, but they were not fatal. Caleb had exaggerated their financial danger because fear made people easier to control. Leah had separate income, separate retirement funds, and, most importantly, time to rebuild. Ruth's duplex remained hers. The fraudulent transaction never closed, so there was no dramatic scene where we won the property back. We simply prevented someone from taking what had never belonged to him. 4 months after the attack, Caleb reached plea agreements in the criminal matters that were ready for resolution while other regulatory consequences continued separately. I will not pretend I felt sympathy when I heard his mortgage license had been suspended. I also did not celebrate. Ruth put it better than I ever could. She was folding laundry when Leah mentioned the licensing decision, and Ruth simply said, "Good." then he can't use that position to do this to someone else. That was the whole point. Accountability was not about whether Caleb suffered enough to satisfy us. It was about whether he could keep doing harm. My daughter learned that lesson differently. One Sunday afternoon, she sat with me in the garage while I repaired an old walnut chair. She watched me clamp a split joint and said, "Dad, I keep replaying all the things I missed." I told her, "Don't grade your past self with information you only have now." She looked at me. "You knew something was wrong," I suspected. "That's not the same as knowing." Mom knew he was cruel. Your mother knew how he treated her. She didn't know everything else. Leah rubbed her hands together. How do I trust myself after this? I set down the clamp. By remembering that trust isn't a promise never to be fooled. It's a promise that when facts change, you're allowed to change your mind. She nodded slowly. Before she left, she asked me the question I had been avoiding. Do you hate him? I thought about Caleb standing above Ruth on the walkway. I thought about my wife's blood on the brick, my daughter's wedding ring clicking against Maurice's conference table, and the folder that had started all of it. Some days, I admitted. But hatred is expensive. I don't want to keep paying for what he did. Leah gave me a small smile. That sounds like something Mom would say. Your mother is smarter than both of us. From the kitchen, Ruth shouted. I heard that, and for the first time in months, all three of us laughed at the same time. 9 months after Caleb pushed my wife, Ruth stood at our kitchen counter signing a routine insurance renewal. I was making coffee and only half paying attention until I noticed something that stopped me. Her hand was steady. After the concussion, after the fractured collarbone, after months of physical therapy and counseling, she no longer hesitated before writing her name. That simple motion affected me more than any court notice ever had. Caleb's case had become a matter for lawyers and agencies. Leah's divorce was close to final. The duplex in Dayton had new tenants. Life had become ordinary again, which was exactly what we had wanted. Ruth capped the pen and caught me watching. What? She asked. Nothing. Grant. I smiled. Your signature. She looked down at the page, then understood. Months earlier, her name had been something Caleb believed he could copy, borrow, and use without permission. Now she had written it herself without fear. She slid the document across the counter and said, Looks pretty good to me. Always has. That afternoon, my daughter came over, carrying groceries and a ridiculous potted lemon tree she insisted would survive an Ohio winter if we kept it near the right window. We spent the day arguing cheerfully about where to put it. No one mentioned Caleb. No one needed to. Later, while Ruth and Leah cleaned the kitchen, I stepped onto the front porch and looked at the brick column beside the stairs. I had considered replacing it because I hated what it reminded me of. In the end, I left it alone. The mark where Ruth's shoulder struck had faded, but not disappeared. I no longer saw it as the place where Caleb nearly broke my family. I saw it as the place where we finally stopped helping him hide what he was doing. For years, I believed keeping peace meant controlling my temper, avoiding accusations, and giving people time to correct themselves. I still believe in restraint. I still believe a man should know the difference between anger and action. But I learned something else at 68 that I should have understood at 40. Silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is the room an abusive person needs in order to keep moving the walls closer. The day Caleb shoved my wife, I wanted to hit him harder than I had ever wanted to hit another human being. I did not. I chose Ruth. I called for help. I told the truth while it was still fresh. I preserved the evidence. Then I let people whose job was to investigate do their work. That decision did not make me weak. It was the strongest thing I did in the entire ordeal. My wife did something even harder. She stopped confusing compassion with permission. My daughter did something harder still. She accepted that the man she loved was not the man she had believed him to be, and she walked away before his lies could become the rest of her life. If I learned anything from watching the two of them rebuild, it is this. Protecting your family does not mean hiding what hurts them. Love does not require you to excuse cruelty because the cruel person shares your last name, your table, or your history. And when someone repeatedly mistakes your kindness for weakness, you do not have to become cruel to prove them wrong. Sometimes you make one emergency call, one truthful statement, one careful decision, and then you stand still while the truth finally catches up.